It began with a roar above the frozen waters of the Baltic, a sound that sent shivers down the corridors of NATO command. 3 Russian fighter jets flying dangerously low sliced through the skies above a German frigate like predators, testing the prey. The date was recent, the location international waters near the Baltic Sea. What followed would expose the deepest strategic blunder of Vladimir Putin's military gamble. In just a few days, Russia crossed a line it could never step back from. Without warning or coordination, 3 MiG-31 warplanes violated Estonian airspace for nearly 12 minutes, an eternity in modern warfare. To the Kremlin, it was a show of strength, a reminder that Moscow could still intimidate the West. But to NATO commanders, it was something far more serious, a declaration that the rules no longer applied. According to reports from Reuters and Deutsche Welle, Putin's generals believed the alliance was tired, divided, and unwilling to respond. They assumed that at most there would be diplomatic protests and another round of empty sanctions. But what they misjudged was the patience of their opponents. Because while those jets were still returning to their bases, radar screens in Russia's own command center in St. Petersburg began to light up like a storm of ghosts. Hundreds of unidentified signals appeared all at once, each one an echo of something moving fast, silent, and coordinated across the Baltic theater. Inside the Western Military District headquarters, panic spread like fire. Officers shouted for confirmation. Was it a driller cyber glitch, or something far worse, a NATO strike forming just outside Kaliningrad's defensive perimeter? The silence that followed was the answer itself. On the horizon of Russia's most sensitive frontier, a military buildup was unfolding, one that had not been predicted in any simulation. For decades, Kaliningrad had been Moscow's iron fortress, an isolated but heavily armed outpost wedged between Poland and Lithuania, bristling with nuclear-capable missiles and radar domes aimed at Europe. But now the fortress looked surrounded. Poland in the west, Sweden in the north, and NATO fleets maneuvering quietly under American coordination. The move was so precise that Russian analysts later called it the perfect noose. The operation's codename, revealed only later by Western media, was Gotland Sentinel. Planned discreetly between Washington, London, and Warsaw, it was a joint exercise with a single goal: to simulate a complete lockdown of the Baltic Sea, the heart of Russia's northern power projection. What Putin had dismissed as a routine NATO exercise was in reality a rehearsal for the strategic encirclement of Kaliningrad itself. At that moment, the Baltic turned from a neutral sea into a chessboard of high-stakes moves. Sweden, the historically neutral state, had quietly joined NATO's inner circle. Poland, the region's military powerhouse, stood ready as the alliance's hammer. And in the dark waters between them, something unprecedented was forming, a seamless, coordinated trap that Russia could neither see nor stop. By the time the sirens wailed in St. Petersburg, it was already too late. The storm had begun. But what kind of alliance could drive Moscow into such panic, and why was this operation designed like a perfect checkmate? The answer begins with Poland, the hammer of NATO. To understand how the Baltic trap was forged, one must start with Poland, the nation that has learned through centuries of invasion and betrayal that survival in Eastern Europe comes only through strength. When Russia's tanks rolled into Ukraine 3 years ago, Poland did not hesitate. It rearmed faster than any European country in modern history, transforming itself into NATO's most battle-ready fortress on the eastern flank. The strategy was clear: to become the hammer that would crush any threat coming from the east. Warsaw's doctrine was not diplomacy, but dominance. According to Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly, Poland's military investments have surpassed even Germany and France combined, creating an armoured wall unmatched on the continent. Over 1,500 tanks, American M102 Abrams and South Korean K2 Black Panthers, are now the twin fists of this new force. The Abrams brings raw, devastating power. The K2 advanced sensors and agility. Together they are the embodiment of a modern iron wall, mobile, intelligent, and merciless. Behind this armoured tide stands a ring of fire. Dozens of HIMARS and South Korean Chunmoo rocket systems line the frontier, each capable of striking targets deep inside Belarus or Kaliningrad from hundreds of kilometers away. In a future conflict, command centers, ammunition depots, and radar stations could be obliterated long before a single tank reaches the border. Poland's artillery is no longer defensive. It is surgical and offensive, capable of paralyzing an enemy's entire logistics network before the first shot of ground combat begins. Above them, the Silent Guardians, Poland's fleet of F-35 stealth fighters, operate as the brain of the battlefield. These aircraft can slip deep behind enemy lines, invisible to radar, scanning every movement and transmitting live data to ground units. They are the eyes of the hammer, feeding targets to the rocket batteries and tank divisions below with the precision of a surgeon's hand. In this digital battlefield, every Polish soldier, every armoured vehicle is linked through a networked system that merges human instinct with machine intelligence. But Poland's strength is not measured only in steel, it is in its will. As one senior officer told DW in a recent interview, "We do not wait for the enemy to come to Warsaw. We meet him on his road." That mentality, aggressive defence through preemptive deterrence, has turned Poland into the backbone of NATO's entire eastern line. And so when the mysterious radar echoes appeared over the Baltic, it was Poland that first understood the message. The movements of its F-35s were not accidental. They were part of a hidden choreography, a demonstration that NATO could seal off Russia's access to the Baltic Sea within hours if provoked. The hammer was already raised, it only needed a spark. Yet brute force alone would not complete the trap. To strike decisively, the hammer needed a scalpel, a partner that could cut silently, unseen and precise. That role fell to a nation once defined by neutrality, but now reborn as one of NATO's deadliest assets. That nation was Sweden, the scalpel of the North. If Poland represents NATO's hammer, Sweden is the scalpel that slices with precision and silence. For centuries, Sweden stood apart from wars that engulfed Europe, mastering neutrality as both shield and philosophy. But when Russian warplanes violated its airspace and missiles began crossing the skies of nearby Ukraine, Stockholm made a historic decision. It would no longer stand aside. Sweden entered NATO not as a passive member, but as a high-tech predator designed for stealth and intelligence. Unlike Poland's thunderous tanks, Sweden's doctrine is surgical strike first, vanish instantly. The best embodiment of this strategy is the Visby-class stealth corvette, a ship that looks more like a shadow than a vessel. Built entirely from carbon fibre, its radar signature is so minimal that it can glide through the Baltic archipelagos like a phantom. Hidden among thousands of islands, these ships can unleash anti-ship missiles powerful enough to sink Russian warships many times their size and disappear before the enemy can lock on. But the real terror for the Kremlin lurks beneath the surface. Sweden's Gotland-class submarines, legendary in naval circles, are almost supernatural in their silence. Powered by air-independent propulsion (AIP), they can operate for weeks without surfacing. In past NATO exercises, one of these submarines even managed to infiltrate an American aircraft carrier defense perimeter, undetected, an achievement that stunned naval strategists. For Russia's Baltic fleet, these submarines are nightmares that hunt unseen, waiting for a single command to strike. Above the waves, the Swedish JS-39 Gripen E fighter jets form the protective shield of the North. Agile, lightweight and lethal, they can take off from ordinary highways, refuel in hidden locations and fire Meteor missiles, among the world's most advanced air-to-air weapons. The Gripen's mission is clear control the Baltic skies and keep Russian bombers away from Swedish and Polish coasts. When Poland's hammer and Sweden's scalpel combined under the Gotland Sentinel exercise, the result was a military symphony designed to strangle the Baltic Sea. The operation simulated the nightmare Russia had feared for decades, the isolation of Kaliningrad and the destruction of its naval access routes. Swedish submarines tracked imaginary Russian fleets leaving port, transmitting real-time data to Poland's F-35s and HIMARS batteries. Within minutes, Polish rockets locked onto targets that would in a real conflict be Russian landing ships and supply depots. At the same time, Sweden's stealth corvettes positioned themselves in the island labyrinth, ready to ambush. If the exercise were real, those Russian vessels would never reach Gotland. They would vanish beneath the waves before even sighting the coast. The message to the Kremlin was unmistakable: any aggression in the Baltic would mean total annihilation before the first soldier lands. Analysts at Reuters later called Gotland Sentinel a demonstration of 21st century warfare, silent, precise, and psychological. Because unlike the brute force of old conflicts, this was a new era of digital integration, stealth and coordination. And as the final day of the exercise ended, Sweden made a declaration that shook Europe to its core. Neutrality was dead. Deterrence had become offence. The world watched in disbelief as Sweden, the once peaceful Nordic nation that had remained neutral for over 2 centuries, delivered one of the most direct military warnings in its history. Standing before a wall of Swedish flags, the commander of the Royal Air Force declared to reporters, "We are ready to shoot down any Russian aircraft that violates our borders. We have no hesitation on this matter." Those words mark the end of an era, the official burial of neutrality, replaced by a fierce and unapologetic doctrine of deterrence through readiness. The Kremlin, caught off guard, scrambled for an answer. State media tried to downplay the statement, calling it Western hysteria. Yet inside Russia's own defense ministry, the alarm was real. Analysts began to realize that the Baltic, once regarded as Moscow's private lake, had become a sealed trap, a cage in which every Russian move could be predicted and countered. The Gotland Sentinel exercise was more than a rehearsal. It was a declaration that NATO could close the Baltic in 48 hours. If Russian forces attempted to break through, they would be struck from air, land and sea simultaneously. Sweden's submarines beneath the surface, Poland's artillery on the shore, and NATO's fighter jets above an unbreakable triangle of death for any invading fleet. This shift had enormous geopolitical consequences. For decades, Russia relied on Kaliningrad as both a military bastion and a political symbol. Bristling with Iskander missiles and advanced radar arrays, it projected power deep into Europe. But now the fortress had become a liability, surrounded, isolated, and exposed. Deutsche Welle analysts compared it to a ticking time bomb that Moscow can no longer control. The strategic dilemma for Putin was absolute. Either he abandons Kaliningrad to avoid confrontation with NATO, losing face and credibility, or he diverts critical units from the Ukrainian front to reinforce it, weakening his already overstretched army. Every option spelled defeat. The Kremlin's own doctrine of simultaneous multi-front control had collapsed under the weight of its own aggression. Meanwhile, Western capitals sensed the turning point. In Washington and London, officials quietly celebrated what they called a bloodless encirclement. Without firing a single shot, NATO had forced Moscow to retreat into its own shell. It was, as one British strategist put it, a checkmate achieved with patience, not bullets. But for Putin, patience had turned into humiliation. The man who once dictated the tempo of global crises now found himself reacting, guessing, and fearing. Reports from Reuters suggested rising tension inside Russia's general staff, with commanders divided between defending the Baltic or holding the crumbling front lines in Ukraine. The map no longer favoured the Kremlin. The north was sealed by Sweden and Poland. The south burned under Ukraine's relentless drone and missile campaign. Every corridor that once carried Russian power now looked like a dead end. And yet, despite the trap closing, Moscow was far from surrendering. The world had seen the Kremlin's next moves before propaganda, cyber warfare, and nuclear threats. But this time, those cards no longer carried the same fear. Because when strength fades, desperation begins. Cornered and humiliated, the Kremlin did what it always does when reality turns against it. It reached for the shadows. Within hours of the Gotland Sentinel exercise ending, Moscow unleashed its first counterattack, not with missiles, but with words. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova appeared on television, her tone fierce, her message predictable. She called the drills an aggressive NATO provocation and accused the West of pushing Europe to the brink of war. The speech was meant to mask panic. In truth, Russia had no viable military answer to the Polish-Swedish alliance forming in the Baltic. The so-called Baltic bastion, once the cornerstone of Russia's regional strategy, had turned into a geopolitical trap. The Kremlin's loud denunciations were a performance for domestic audiences, a desperate attempt to disguise a strategic disaster as foreign provocation. According to BBC and Reuters, this propaganda campaign was accompanied by a surge in cyber and electronic warfare. GPS interference over the Baltic Sea suddenly intensified, disrupting civilian flights and naval operations. Hackers linked to Russian intelligence targeted power grids in Sweden and government networks in Poland, attempting to sow chaos. These were not attacks of strength, but of frustration, a digital tantrum from a regime losing control of the battlefield. Still, the most chilling element of Russia's response was its return to nuclear rhetoric. Dmitry Medvedev, once the soft-spoken face of the Kremlin, now echoed the tone of desperation. Any threat to Kaliningrad will be answered with total annihilation, he warned. It was a familiar playbook, the threat of nuclear fire to compensate for conventional weakness. But Western intelligence assessed the bluff differently this time. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly noted that such rhetoric no longer carried credibility. NATO had seen too many of these threats go unanswered. The alliance understood that Russia's nuclear deterrent, though real, had become a tool of psychological warfare, a sign of impotence, not dominance. Meanwhile, inside, Russia cracks were showing. Generals privately admitted that the country's forces could not handle another active front while still bleeding men and armor in Ukraine. Mobilization fatigue had set in. Families were protesting quietly in provincial towns. Sanctions were biting deep, and the economy, once buoyed by oil exports, was slowing under the weight of isolation. The international narrative had flipped. Where once NATO feared escalation, now Russia feared encirclement. The phrase strategic checkmate appeared in European newspapers, symbolizing a new reality that Moscow had been trapped by its own aggression. In trying to intimidate its neighbors, it had forged the very coalition that would now contain it. By the autumn of 2025, intelligence reports described a changed Baltic-Polish HIMARS stationed near the border, Swedish submarines patrolling silently beneath the waves, and American reconnaissance aircraft circling high above. Russia, once the hunter, had become the hunted. And yet, as the storm over the Baltic raged, another bloodier front was about to eclipse it entirely. Because while the northern trap closed around Kaliningrad, the southern seas were already witnessing the unthinkable, the destruction of Russia's naval pride by a country that officially had no navy at all. That country was Ukraine. While the Baltic turned into a cage of steel and silence, another humiliation unfolded far to the south, one even more devastating. In the warm waters of the Black Sea, Russia's proud naval empire was being dismantled piece by piece by a nation that technically had no navy. Ukraine, through ingenuity and desperation, had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. What began as a handful of experimental projects quickly evolved into a full-fledged revolution. Using domestically built kamikaze sea drones, small, fast radar-evading boats packed with explosives, Ukraine managed to do what no Western fleet had achieved in decades: destroy Russia's Black Sea fleet without fielding a single warship of its own. These sea babies, as soldiers called them, skimmed the surface of the water at night undetected, guided by satellite and artificial intelligence. They struck at the vulnerable underbellies of massive Russian ships, where armor was weakest and pride was greatest. The first major blow came when one of these drones pierced the flagship Moskva, sending the symbol of Russian naval dominance to the bottom of the sea. From that moment on, panic spread through Sevastopol. Even the most advanced air defense systems could not intercept these small, relentless killers. Every harbor became a death trap. Every patrol turned into a risk. Ukraine's strategy was genius in its simplicity. Once the sea drones pushed the Russian fleet into its own ports, long-range missiles took over the hunt. Neptune and Storm Shadow scalp strikes began pounding docks, command centers, and ammunition depots. What had started as a series of daring raids soon turned into systematic annihilation. One by one, landing ships, submarines, and missile corvettes were destroyed. Russia's once mighty Black Sea fleet became a fleet in name only, crippled, hiding, and broken. By mid-2025, the last surviving vessels fled from Sevastopol to the safer but weaker port of Novorossiysk. The retreat was symbolic. A fleet that had once projected power across the Mediterranean could now barely protect its own coastline. Without dominance in the Black Sea, Moscow lost the ability to threaten Ukraine's southern shores or launch amphibious assaults. The combined effect of these northern and southern disasters was catastrophic. From Gotland to Crimea, Russia found itself encircled by a new form of warfare, intelligent, connected, and adaptive. Poland and Sweden in the North Ukraine, and NATO support in the south, two fronts, two different wars, one shared result: the collapse of Russia's maritime power. Experts at Al Jazeera and DW now call this the age of invisible warfare, where small nations armed with technology can outthink and outmaneuver superpowers. Putin's empire, stretched thin and bleeding, no longer dictates the rhythm of conflict. It reacts, retreats, and blames others for what its own arrogance created. And as history watches, the world understands a new truth in modern war: size means nothing without strategy. Because sometimes the smallest waves sink the largest ships. The collapse of Russia's naval dominance marks more than a military defeat, it is the end of an era. The empires that once ruled through intimidation now face a battlefield where intelligence coordination and resilience decide everything. In the Baltic, Sweden and Poland have shown that unity is deadlier than any missile. In the Black Sea, Ukraine has proven that creativity can overpower fear. These twin victories reshape not only Europe but the balance of global power. The Kremlin's myth of invincibility lies shattered across two seas. One frozen, one warm, both echoing the same truth: aggression carries a price and arrogance always meets its reckoning. For the West, this is a moment of reflection. The Gotland Sentinel alliance demonstrates what preparation and unity can achieve without a single bullet fired. But it also serves as a warning that new forms of warfare demand constant vigilance, innovation, and courage. As the world edges toward an uncertain future, one question remains: will Moscow accept its new limits? Or will it gamble again, risking everything in a desperate bid to reclaim lost pride? The waves of the Baltic and Black Seas whisper the answer, but only time will tell. If you found this analysis revealing, subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts below. History is unfolding before our eyes, and your voice matters in understanding where it leads next.